A grandfather secretly entered the morgue, pouring a mysterious liquid into the mouths of his dead granddaughters. But what happened next left everyone stunned when the police arrived. The phone's shrill ring shattered the silence of George's small study. He hesitated, staring at the old rotary phone as if it held a serpent coiled within. When he finally picked up, the voice on the other end was soft, measured, but every word landed like a hammer. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry to inform you. Daniela and Mariana have passed away. The doctors, they did everything they could, but..." George felt the words dissolve into a blur of static. His grip tightened on the receiver as a searing pain bloomed in his chest. He struggled to speak, his voice trembling as the air seemed to thin around him. "What happened?" he croaked. "They were fine just yesterday. There was an incident. The details are unclear, but they were found unconscious in their room. It appears to have been sudden." The receiver slipped from his fingers, swaying on its cord like a pendulum. George staggered backward, clutching the table to steady himself. His mind raced through a kaleidoscope of memories: Daniela's laughter as she chased butterflies in the garden, Mariana's shy smile when she showed him her latest drawing. But those images were suddenly shadowed by a face: Lucia, his late son's second wife, cold, calculating, and always resentful of the inheritance that bypassed her to secure the girl's future. George's jaw clenched as the pieces of suspicion began to fall into place. "No," he whispered, his voice sharp with rising anger. This wasn't an accident. The morgue was colder than George had imagined, its sterile smell mingling with the metallic bite of disinfectant. The nurse, leading him in, glanced at him with sympathy, her steps slowing as they approached two small bodies lying under crisp white sheets. "Take your time," she murmured, retreating to give him space. George stood motionless, his breath shallow. He took hesitant steps forward, his hands trembling as he pulled back the sheet covering Daniela's face. Her features were peaceful, almost as if she were asleep. His hand hovered above her cheek, but stopped short of touching the cold stillness of death. He turned to Mariana, pulling the sheet back with the same delicate care. The tears he'd held back finally fell, tracing silent paths down his weathered face. "My girls," he whispered, his voice bred king. "You didn't deserve this." His grief was interrupted by a surge of determination. He straightened his shoulders, his tears now drying against the heat of his growing fury. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered again, more firmly. In the hospital's security office, George watched the footage intently. The screen flickered, showing the empty corridor outside his granddaughter's room. Seconds stretched like hours, and then the image of Lucia appeared. She moved quickly, clutching a black bag as she darted glances down the hallway before slipping into the room. "There she is," George exclaimed, pointing to the screen. "She went in there." The head of security, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, leaned closer to the monitor. He watched as Lucia emerged minutes later, her face expressionless, her bag still in hand. "This isn't good," the man muttered. "I'll contact the police right away." "No," George snapped, his voice firm and urgent. "This isn't enough. I need more proof. There's something she's done, something more insidious. I need help." That night, George sat at his kitchen table, the house eerily silent. His hand hovered over a piece of paper with a scrawled phone number, a relic of a friendship long abandoned. He hadn't spoken to Pedro in decades, not since his old friend's fall from grace as a respected toxicologist. "Will you still answer?" George murmured, his fingers finally dialing the number. The line crackled, and after several rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Who's this?" "It's me, Pedro. George." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. "George Thompson." Thought you were done with ghosts like me. Not tonight, George replied. I need your help. My granddaughters, they're dead. Pedro's tone shifted, the weight of George's words cutting through any lingering bitterness. Dead? What happened? Lucia, George said, the name spilling out like venom. She poisoned them. I know it. But I think they might still be alive. Pedro, is there something, anything, that mimics death? Pedro sighed. A long and burdened sound. There are compounds, yes, but reversing them depends on time and the exact poison used. George's voice cracked as he pleaded, You're the only one who can help me, please. Pedro hesitated before finally relenting. I'll come. But George, if this is what you think it is, you're walking into a storm you might not survive. I'll survive, George said, his voice steady. For them, I'll survive. As the night stretched on, George clung to the fragile thread of hope Pedro had offered. There was a heavy silence, thick with tension, before Pedro finally spoke. I've got something, he said, his voice measured but grim. It's a strong antidote, not something you'll find in pharmacies or hospitals. But let me warn you, it's risky. It was used in experiments, and there's no guarantee it'll work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And if you use it wrong, it could kill them for real. Give me the chance, George pleaded, his voice cracking, though not from weakness. It was the sound of a man willing to face any danger. Those girls deserve to live, Pedro. Pedro's tone turned firm, brooking no argument. You'll have to come to get it. I can't send it or deliver it anywhere. Be quick. There's no time to waste. George grabbed his coat without hesitation, his mind fixed on a single goal: to save them or die trying. He drove through the darkened streets, the city seeming more menacing than usual. Streetlights flickered, and the hum of his car's engine seemed louder than ever, like the ticking of a clock counting down. When he reached Pedro's address, a dilapidated boarding house with peeling paint and grimy windows, George wasted no time. He banged on the door, his voice sharp and urgent. "Open up, Pedro! It's me, George!" The door creaked open, revealing Pedro's haggard figure. He looked older than George remembered, his face lined with exhaustion, dark circles etched under his eyes and his hair disheveled. His frame was slightly hunched and his hands shook faintly, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Get in, quickly," Pedro said, glancing nervously down the hallway. Inside, the air was damp and stale, carrying the scent of mildew and confinement. Bottles and jars cluttered the tables, some with handwritten labels, their contents glowing ominously in the dim, flickering light. Shadows danced on the walls, stretching and twisting with an unsettling life of their own. "This is it," Pedro said, holding up an amber vial filled with a shimmering blue liquid. "You'll need to inject it directly into the heart if they're unconscious. There's no room for error, George. Do you understand?" "I understand," George replied. "Tell me how much I owe you." Pedro gave a bitter smile, shaking his head. "I don't want your money, old friend. I just want this to work. If those girls survive, that'll be enough payment." The two men clasped hands in a silent agreement that went beyond gratitude. George carefully secured the vial in his pocket and stepped out into the night, knowing that every second was critical. George sped back to the hospital, his focus razor-sharp on the road ahead. Doubts clawed at the edges of his mind. What if he was too late? What if the antidote didn't work? But he pushed them aside. There was no room for uncertainty now. When he arrived, the clock had already struck midnight. The hospital loomed in the darkness, its lights flickering as though heralding the start of something monumental. George moved through the halls like a ghost, blending into the shadows. He knew security had been heightened, but he also knew how to slip past unnoticed. At the emergency exit, a guard stood engrossed in his phone. George paused, watching the man's movements carefully, counting each second. The moment the guard turned to check the rear door, George slipped past him, silent as a shadow. Finally, he reached the room where his granddaughters lay. The steady hum of machines was the only sound. Their pale faces were illuminated by the harsh white light, motionless and haunting. He approached Daniela first, pulling the vial and syringe from his pocket. With trembling hands, he filled the syringe, then knelt beside her bed. "I won't fail. Not now," he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. His pulse thundered in his ears as he aimed the needle precisely where Pedro had instructed. His hand wavered for a moment, but with a deep breath he steadied himself and plunged the needle into her chest. The silence in the room was unbearable. George froze, his eyes locked on Daniela's face, searching for any sign of life. Then, suddenly, her chest rose with a sharp gasp, her eyes flew open, and a strained sound escaped her lips. "Daniela!" George exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me. I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered as she struggled to focus. "Grandpa," she murmured, her voice weak but alive. "You're safe, my little one. You're safe," George said, tears streaming down his face. But there was no time for relief. He turned to Mariana, refilling the syringe with the last of the antidote. Kneeling by her bedside, he whispered, "Hold on, Mariana. Stay with me." The process repeated, the needle, the precise pressure. This time, the seconds stretched into an eternity. For a moment, nothing happened, and fear gripped George's heart like a vice. Then Mariana's chest heaved, and her eyes opened, unfocused but alive. George collapsed against the bed, his tears falling freely. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Both of you." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope burned in his chest, fierce and unyielding. The fight wasn't over, but his granddaughters were alive, and that was all that mattered. George wrestled with the doctor, forcing him to drop the flashlight, which hit the floor with a hollow thud. With a firm grip on the man's collar, George leaned in, his voice ice-cold against the doctor's ear. "Listen to me, Doc," he hissed, every word deliberate. "Don't make me do something we'll both regret." The doctor froze, his wide eyes betraying a mix of fear and understanding. George tightened his hold just enough to ensure compliance. "You won't get hurt if you follow my lead," George continued, his tone as sharp as a blade. "You didn't see anything. You didn't hear anything. You'll walk out of this room and you'll forget this ever happened." The doctor nodded shakily, his breaths quick and shallow. George released him, his gaze unyielding as he watched the man scramble to his feet. "If you talk," George said in a voice devoid of emotion, "I'll find you. I have nothing left to lose." The doctor didn't look back as he stumbled toward the door, his footsteps uneven and hurried. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving George alone with his granddaughters. He exhaled deeply, the weight of his resolve settling heavily on his chest. "It's okay now, my girls. It's all going to be okay," he murmured, gripping their cold, fragile hands. His voice quivered, not with fear, but with fierce determination. "No one else will hurt you. Not while I'm still breathing." George sat between their beds, the faint hum of the monitors, the only sound in the room. He stared at the floor, the enormity of what he had just done sinking in. He had crossed a line, one he couldn't retreat from. "Keep breathing, my sweet girls. Just keep breathing," George whispered, his voice soft but insistent, as if his words could will life back into their frail bodies. He glanced at the door every few moments, bracing himself for the next unwelcome visitor. A slight movement caught his eye. Daniela's fingers twitched, the faintest quiver breaking the stillness. George leaned forward, clutching her hand between his trembling palms. Her skin was no longer icy, it was beginning to warm. "Daniela?" he called softly, his face just inches from hers. Her lips parted, and a faint, raspy whisper emerged. "Grandpa!" George's heart leapt. Tears welled in his eyes, but a breathless laugh escaped his throat. "I'm here, my little one. I'm right here. Don't try to talk. Just breathe. Just breathe." Her eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused as she tried to make sense of the face before her. George pressed his forehead gently against hers. "You're safe now," he promised. "No one will hurt you again. I'll make sure of it." A rustling sound from across the room made George turn sharply. Mariana's head shifted from side to side, her lips trembling as shallow gasps escaped her. Relief and dread churned in his chest. "Easy, Mariana. Easy, my love," George soothed, moving to her side. "Don't push yourself. I'm here." Mariana's eyes blinked open, darting erratically before settling on his face. Her breaths came quicker, her chest heaving with the effort. "Grandpa," she croaked, her voice laced with confusion and fear. Where am I?" "You're with me. That's all that matters," George replied, his tone steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Don't think about anything else. Just listen to my voice." His joy was tempered by the realization that their survival made them even more vulnerable. He wiped his face with his sleeve and took a deep breath, standing tall with newfound resolve. "We need to get out of here," he said quietly, but with unwavering determination. He scanned the room, knowing the front door wasn't an option. The doctor might return with reinforcements. His gaze fell on the window. It was sealed, but not impossible to open. Turning back to his granddaughters, George crouched down to their eye level. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "We're leaving. I can't carry you both at the same time, but I need you to help me just a little. Can you do that?" Daniela nodded slowly, her movements tentative but resolute. Mariana followed suit, though her eyes remained wide with confusion. George reached into his pocket and pulled out his trusty multi-tool, the small blade glinting in the dim light. He moved swiftly toward the window, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to himself, the promise of freedom and justice driving him forward. George approached the window, his hands shaking, not from effort, but from sheer urgency. Every second felt like it carried the weight of life and death. With a sharp tug, the latch gave way, and the window creaked open. The cool night air rushed into the room, brushing against his face like a warning. He leaned out to assess the drop. It wasn't high enough to be fatal, but a bad fall could still prove dangerous. Clenching his jaw, George accepted the risk. There was no other choice. "Daniela," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I'm going to help you out first. Take it slow. Don't look down, and don't be afraid. I'll be here the whole time." Her frail body trembled as he lifted her, her weakness cutting him deeper than any blade ever could. George could feel how fragile she had become, the strength drained from her legs. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he positioned her at the window. "Use the wall for support, sweetheart. I'll guide you step by step," he instructed, his voice as gentle as he could manage. Daniela nodded, taking a deep breath before shifting her weight cautiously. George leaned out as far as he could, keeping a firm grip on her small frame, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. "That's it, Daniela. One more step. Just one more," he urged, his eyes never leaving her. She moved down, inch by inch, her face pale with fear but determined. When her feet finally touched the ground, George exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Daniela looked up at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I did it, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and relief. "You did, my girl. You did." He smiled, his eyes glassy but resolute. "Now hide behind that bush and don't move. No matter what happens, stay there." She nodded and stumbled toward the nearest shrub, crouching low and trying to steady her breathing. "Your turn, Mariana," George said as he turned back to the other bed. Mariana was even weaker. Her eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, and she could barely hold her gaze steady. But when she saw her grandfather's face, the silent plea in his eyes, she summoned every ounce of strength left in her. George lifted her with care, ignoring the fiery protests of his aching muscles. He carried her to the window, his arms trembling but steady. "You're stronger than you think, Mariana," he said softly, his voice infused with hope. "I'll be right here. Trust me." Mariana didn't respond, but her wide, frightened eyes spoke volumes. George held her securely as she began to lower herself out of the window. "Just one step at a time, honey. I'm right here," he reassured her, his grip tightening as she faltered. Mariana's foot slipped briefly, and George's heart stopped. He caught her with everything he had left in him. "I've got you. Don't let go, Mariana. Don't let go," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Her feet finally found the ground, but George didn't release her until she steadied herself. "Run to your sister. Go," he urged. Mariana staggered toward Daniela, and the two girls clung to each other, trembling but safe. From the window, George watched them huddle together, hidden among the shadows of the bushes. For the first time that night, a small flicker of triumph lit up his weary heart. But the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway shattered the moment. "Search every room. He couldn't have gotten far," a gruff voice barked. George turned to the open window. There was no time to think. He climbed onto the sill, calculating the drop. At his age, it was a gamble, but hesitation wasn't an option. "Here goes nothing," he muttered through gritted teeth. He jumped. The cold wind stung his face, and when he landed, pain shot up his legs like fire. But he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand. "Run, girls, run!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the night. The three of them disappeared into the shadows of the thick underbrush. The cold bit at George's skin, but he ignored it, pushing forward with every ounce of strength he had. His breathing was ragged, each step a punishment to his knees, but he refused to stop. Ahead of him, Daniela and Mariana stumbled over roots and brambles, their legs trembling but propelled by the pure instinct to survive. "Keep moving! Don't look back!" George yelled, his eyes locked on them. The shouts of the guards and the sharp beams of flashlights grew closer. George's mind raced. He knew luck wouldn't hold out forever. "They're heading for the woods," a guard called from behind. Daniela's wide, terrified eyes met her grandfather's. "They're going to catch us, Grandpa," she sobbed. George crouched in front of her, gripping her shoulders. "Look at me, Daniela. Look at me." His voice was calm, commanding. "They won't catch us. Not while I'm here. Do you understand me?" Mariana whimpered, clutching her arms. "But they're so close." George took her hand and met her gaze with steely determination. "Yes, they are, but I'm closer, and as long as I'm with you, no one will hurt you." The girls' sobs quieted, and for a fleeting moment they believed him. "Now run," he said, pulling them into a quick, fierce hug. We'll run together. Don't stop for anything." The forest thickened around them, offering some semblance of safety. The flashlights dimmed in the distance, but George knew the search wouldn't end here. For now, they had to keep going. There was no other choice. "We need a place to hide," George thought, scanning the dark forest around him. In the distance, the faint outline of a weathered wooden shack emerged, nearly swallowed by moss and decay. The roof sagged, the walls leaned precariously, but it was their best chance. "There!" George whispered sharply, motioning toward the shack. He quickened his pace, ushering Daniela and Mariana ahead of him. "Hurry, get inside, and stay quiet." The two girls obeyed without question. George was the last to enter, carefully shutting the warped wooden door, leaving only a narrow crack to monitor the outside. His breath was steady, but his darting eyes betrayed the storm within him. Every sense was heightened, every muscle taut. "How long do we have to stay here?" Mariana whispered, her voice trembling. "As long as it takes," George replied, his gaze fixed on the dense forest. "Listen to me carefully. If you hear dogs or voices, stay absolutely silent. No matter what happens, do you understand?" The girls nodded, clinging to each other in a corner of the shack. They tried to suppress their sobs, but the cold crept in, biting at their fragile bodies. George shrugged off his coat and draped it over them. "Here," he said softly, his voice momentarily gentle. "You need to stay warm." He crouched down to their level, his face shadowed with worry. "It'll be over soon." His words were meant to comfort, but they were hollow. George knew there were no guarantees. From somewhere deep in the forest, the barking of dogs pierced the stillness, each sound a hammer blow to George's chest. His jaw tightened as he closed his eyes, bracing himself. "They're in the woods now," a commanding voice called out, breaking the night. "Keep the dogs moving, they'll sniff them out." The heavy crunch of boots on dead leaves grew louder. George peeked through the crack in the door and spotted 3 figures with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness. Behind them, 2 dogs strained against their leashes, noses to the ground. The search party was closing in. "Check the area," barked one of the men. "If you see anything, call it in immediately." George gripped the door with both hands, holding it steady so it wouldn't betray them with a creak. Time seemed to stretch painfully thin as the footsteps drew closer. Leaves crunched just outside the shack. The dogs panted loudly, their noses pressing against the ground, their claws scratching at the earth. "Quiet, boy," one of the men murmured to a restless dog tugging its leash. "Probably just a raccoon or something." The flashlight beam swept across the shack, its harsh light slipping through the cracks in the planks. For a brief moment, it illuminated Mariana's pale face. George moved instantly, casting a shadow over her with his body, shielding her from view. "Nothing here," one of the guards said at last. "Let's move on." The steps receded, but the dogs continued to bark, their frustration echoing into the night. George waited, motionless, until the forest returned to its uneasy silence. Only then did he allow himself to lean back against the shack wall, exhaling shakily. "Are they gone?" Mariana asked, her voice quivering. "Yes," George replied, though his breath was still unsteady. Daniela crawled over and wrapped her arms around his chest. George hugged her tightly, his fingers brushing the back of her head. "How much longer, Grandpa?" Daniela asked quietly. "How much longer do we have to keep running?" George didn't answer immediately. The weight of her question hung heavy in the damp air. "As long as it takes," he finally said, his voice low. "We'll do whatever it takes." The girls huddled closer to him, their small bodies trembling as exhaustion overtook them. George stroked Daniela's hair gently. "Rest now," he murmured. "We've got a long night ahead." The first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks in the wooden planks, casting faint lines of light on the cold, dirt-strewn floor. Dew clung to the leaves outside, and the soft chirping of birds heralded a new day. For George, however, there was no relief. He hadn't slept a wink. His eyes were red, his face hollowed with exhaustion, but his resolve was sharper than ever. Seated by the door, he watched every shadow, listened for every sound. His hands, rough and calloused, were poised for action. In the corner, Daniela and Mariana lay curled together beneath his coat, their small breaths steadying in the quiet. "It's over now," George whispered to himself, though he knew it wasn't true. The worst was still to come. He cast his gaze upward, the faint light catching in his weary eyes. "I'll protect you," he promised under his breath, barely audible. "No matter what." The forest remained silent, but George stayed alert. His body was worn, but his mind remained a burning beacon of vigilance. He was the wall standing between his granddaughters and the relentless danger hunting them. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the world outside, George knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't fail them. Not now. Not ever. In the distance, the sharp crack of branches underfoot froze George in place. He leaned forward, every muscle in his body taut, his eyes locked on the thin gap of the door. This wasn't the guards or their dogs, it was something else, something deliberate. "Grandpa," Mariana's sleepy voice called softly. "Shh, sweetheart," George replied in a low, firm tone, his gaze unwavering. "Stay close to your sister. Don't move, no matter what." The footsteps grew louder, steady and measured. These weren't the frantic strides of guards from the night before. No, this person was different. Their pace was deliberate, each step sinking into the damp earth with calculated purpose. George took a deep breath and edged toward the door. Carefully, he peered through the crack, his heart pounding. What he saw made it stop momentarily. Lucia. She strode into view in a sleek black coat, dark sunglasses masking her eyes, and low-heeled boots that barely left impressions in the soil. Her movements were confident, almost casual, as though she owned the world. Her hands rested in her coat pockets, exuding the poise of someone who feared nothing and no one. "Come out, George," Lucia called, her voice calm yet piercing. "I know you're in there. Don't make this harder than it already is." George clenched his jaw, his body tense as steel. He remained silent. "You won't win this time, old man," Lucia continued, her tone light but laced with venom. She pivoted slowly, scanning the dense forest. "No matter how far you run or how well you hide, I'll always find you. You're out of strength, George. Face it. Everything is mine. The estate, the inheritance, the girls. It all belongs to me." George's chest burned with restrained fury, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. He wouldn't let her words crack him. "You still think you can save them?" Lucia let out a soft laugh. "You're deluded. This world isn't kind to the weak. You're an old man. They're just fragile children. And me? I'm the future." George glanced back at the girls, who were huddled together in silence. Daniela's wide, fearful eyes met his. "Don't listen to her, Daniela," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. "She doesn't control us." A sudden snap of a branch outside made him whip his head toward the gap. Lucia had moved closer, too close. "Don't make me come in there," she warned, her smile curling into a smirk. "I'd hate to ruin this coat." George's eyes darted around the dim shed until they landed on a broken piece of wood, its edge jagged and sharp. He grabbed it, gripping it tightly in his weathered hands. "There's no escape, George," Lucia taunted as her boots creaked on the old wooden steps. "It's over." She pushed the door open with deliberate force and stepped inside, her posture unshaken. Her eyes scanned the shadows until they landed on the girls. Her lips curved into an unsettlingly sweet smile. "My precious girls," she crooned, her voice dripping with mock affection. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Aren't you afraid of the dark?" Mariana clung to Daniela, who pressed her lips together to stifle a cry. Lucia took another step toward them. "Don't worry. I'll take you home, where you belong. I'll protect you. No one, not even your stubborn grandfather, can hurt you." But before she could turn fully, George struck. With a swift, forceful blow, he drove the jagged wood into the back of her knee. Lucia let out a sharp cry of pain, collapsing to the floor as her hands shot out to break her fall. "You fool!" she hissed, her voice ragged with fury. She tried to push herself up, but George was already upon her. "No!" he growled, pinning her down with a strength that belied his age. The sharp wood pressed against her throat as his voice rose in a furious roar. "You will never touch them again!" Lucia thrashed beneath him, kicking and striking with her fists. But George didn't falter. His face was inches from hers, his piercing gaze locking onto her eyes with an intensity she had never seen before. "You'll never lay a hand on them," he said through gritted teeth. "Do you understand me? This ends here, Lucia, for good." Her eyes widened, but instead of fear, a strange smile crept across her lips. "You can't do this, George," she whispered, her voice uneven but taunting. "If you kill me, you'll become a monster, just like me." The words echoed in George's mind. For a moment his hands trembled. He stared into her eyes and saw the void within, cold, unfeeling, and utterly devoid of remorse. She wasn't human, and that realization made him let go. George stood, his body rigid as he backed away. His breathing was labored, his hands shaking as the jagged wood fell to the floor. "You'll never win," he said, his voice resolute. Lucia's twisted smile lingered as she pulled herself up, her eyes gleaming with malevolent amusement. But George didn't care. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. For his granddaughters, he would find a way to end this, once and for all. George clutched his throat, struggling to catch his breath as Lucia's mocking laughter echoed in the dim light. "That's what I thought," she sneered, her voice rasping. "You don't have it in you. You're not like me." "You're right," George said, his breathing ragged. "I'm nothing like you, but I don't need to be like you to stop you." He took Daniela and Mariana by their hands and pulled them out of the cabin without a glance back. Their footsteps rustled the fallen leaves, their movements quick and determined as the rising sun began to pierce through the trees. Behind them, Lucia remained on the floor, her laughter fading into a choking gasp. Though she had lost this skirmish, the war was far from over, and she knew it. George, leading the girls through the forest, replayed her venomous words in his mind. She had been right about one thing. Darkness isn't defeated by kindness alone. Something in him had shifted, his mind now sharper, colder. This wasn't over. He gripped Daniela's hand tighter and whispered, "There's no going back now." In the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke through the silence. The police had arrived, but George didn't trust them. Not anymore. He had learned the hard way that in a world of monsters, heroes didn't wear capes. They wore scars. The forest was eerily quiet. No barking dogs, no shouting voices, only the crunch of dry leaves underfoot as George and the girls pushed forward. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the branches, lighting their path, though the journey felt endless. Daniela and Mariana clung to his hands, their legs weary but determined not to stop. George's gaze was fixed ahead, his jaw set, his steps more resolute than they'd been all night. "Grandpa, I can't go on," Mariana whimpered, her small body sagging against his arm. George stopped immediately, kneeling down to meet her eyes. The exhaustion on her face tore at his heart, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I know, sweetheart. I know you're tired. But we're almost there," he said, brushing her tangled hair back gently. "I need just a little more strength from you, just a little more. You've got it in you. I know you do." Daniela, panting beside them, crouched to take her sister's hand. "Come on, Mary," she urged, her voice steady despite the strain in her breathing. "You're stronger than me. You've always been stronger. We can do this together." Mariana glanced between her sister and her grandfather, her eyes brimming with tears. Though her small frame trembled with exhaustion, there was a flicker of resolve in her gaze. George saw it immediately. She wasn't just a child. She was a fighter. "All right," Mariana said softly, pushing herself upright with a shaky breath. "I can do it." "That's my girl," George said with a brief but proud smile, his chest tightening as he watched her determination. The three resumed their march through the dense forest. George had chosen this direction for a reason. High on the hill lay an old cabin, a forgotten relic from his younger days hunting with his son. It had been abandoned for years, but he was certain it could provide them shelter, even if just for a little while. As they walked, George's mind churned with memories of his confrontation with Lucia. Her disdainful smirk haunted him, her cutting words still sharp in his ears. "If you kill me, you'll become just like me," she had taunted, her voice rasping. "I'm not like you," George had retorted. But the weight of those words lingered now. What did it mean to become a monster? Was it the act of defending his family at any cost? Or was it the loss of his own soul along the way? "Grandpa, where are we going now?" Daniela's voice broke through the silence. "Somewhere safe," he replied without hesitation. "A place no one will find us." "And Lucia?" Mariana asked, her tone laced with fear. "Will she come back for us?" George stopped and turned to face his granddaughters. He knelt down, looking them directly in the eyes. "No," he said firmly. "She won't come back for you." The certainty in his voice silenced the girls. They exchanged a glance, nodded in unison, and continued walking without another word. At last, the cabin emerged from the overgrowth, its weathered frame battered by time. The broken windows and sagging roof spoke of years of neglect, but to them, it was a sanctuary. "Let's go inside," George said, his voice steady. "We need to rest." He pushed open the creaky door with his shoulder, the sound breaking the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. A rickety wooden table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched, overturned chairs. A long, dead fireplace still held the remnants of old ashes, sparking an idea in George. He moved toward the fireplace and began gathering the dry branches piled in the corner. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" Daniela asked, sinking to the floor beside her sister. "Making sure we stay warm," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I'll light a fire. The warmth will help us rest," George said, pulling a box of matches from his coat pocket. He struck one against the box, the spark catching instantly. Flames licked the dry wood, growing steadily until the small cabin was bathed in a warm, flickering glow. Daniela and Mariana edged closer to the fireplace, their weary bodies leaning into the comforting heat. For the first time in hours, the tension in their muscles began to ease. "Grandpa," Mariana murmured, reclining against the wooden wall. "What are we going to do now?" George crouched by the fire, staring at the dancing flames. The shadows on his face shifted, revealing a calm that carried an undercurrent of something sharper. "We'll take back everything," he said quietly. His tone carried a dangerous resolve. "Your home. Your peace. Your lives. Everything Lucia tried to steal from you." He let the words hang in the air before adding, "But first, we rest." The girls exchanged tired glances before wrapping their arms around each other. Slowly, they drifted off to sleep, their breathing steady. George sat in silence, watching them. The firelight reflected in his eyes, but his gaze stayed sharp. He wouldn't allow his guard to drop. Outside, justice had yet to come, but his pursuit of it had already begun. Hours slipped by. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional sigh from the sleeping children. Then a noise broke the stillness, a faint but deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel outside the cabin. George straightened, his senses immediately alert. That wasn't the sound of branches snapping or animals moving. It was unmistakably human. Rising slowly, he grabbed the broken leg of a chair lying by the wall. His grip tightened as he moved toward the door, with deliberate silence. The footsteps stopped. He could feel a presence just beyond the wooden barrier. "I know you're in there, George," a man's voice called out, low and steady. A shiver ran down George's spine. He recognized that voice. It was Julian, one of the men who had worked for his late son before betraying the family and siding with Lucia. "I'm not here to fight," Julian continued. "I just want to talk." George said nothing, his breathing slowing as he steadied his pulse. "Lucia's furious," Julian added. "She says you attacked her. She wants you to pay for it. But I'm not here for her. I'm here for you." George remained silent, his eyes narrowing. He didn't move, the chair leg still firm in his grip. "Listen," Julian pressed. "Lucia doesn't hold all the cards anymore. Things are shifting. Her power isn't what it used to be. The police are already investigating what happened to the girls. Someone talked. I came here to offer you something." "I don't need anything from you," George said coldly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're wrong," Julian replied, a thin smile audible in his tone. "I can give you Lucia." The silence grew heavier. George's jaw tightened and his hands trembled slightly as he considered the weight of Julian's words. "Why would you betray her?" George finally asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "I'm sick of her," Julian admitted, his tone losing its bravado. "She thinks she's untouchable, but we both know she's not. You know it? I know it. Together we can take her down, but you need me." George glanced at the girls, still peacefully asleep by the fire. Their faces, so innocent despite everything they'd endured, reignited the storm of rage and grief inside him. He turned back to the door, speaking in a low, measured voice. "Give me one reason not to break your head right now." "Because I'm the only one who knows where she's hiding," Julian shot back. "And I promise you this time she won't slip away." The fire crackled, its glow illuminating George's steely expression. He exhaled deeply, shutting his eyes for a moment. "Come in," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The door creaked open, and Julian stepped inside, his hands raised in mock surrender. He wore a sly grin, the kind of smile a man has when he knows he's struck a deal. "Let's topple the Queen," Julian said, his smile turning grim. George nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. There was no room for doubt. It was time to bring Lucia down, once and for all. The steady rhythm of rain against the cabin roof filled the room as the fire continued to burn. Outside, the sky was a blanket of grey, and the cold wind slipped through the cracks in the old wood. Inside, Julian sat on a broken chair, drumming his fingers nervously on the table. Occasionally, his eyes darted to the door as if expecting an ambush. George didn't take his eyes off Julian, mistrust carved into every line of his face. The girls, still asleep by the fire, were huddled close, their breaths deep and even. "Tell me where she is," George said finally, breaking the tense silence. Julian leaned forward, his smirk fading into a look of grim seriousness. "She's holed up at her sister's house, the one out on the old hilltop estate," he said quietly. "She's got 2 men with her, but they're just muscle. Nothing you can't handle." George's mind raced. He remembered that house years ago. It had been a place of family gatherings and laughter. Now, it was the lair of a snake. "Why tell me this?" George asked, his voice sharp. "You're not the type to bite the hand that feeds you." Julian let out a bitter laugh. "Lucia never fed me, George. She used me, like she uses everyone. Promised me money, power, but all I got was being her watchdog." George's jaw tightened as he processed the information. The flames crackled louder, and the rain outside seemed to fall harder. Whatever lay ahead, George knew one thing: there would be no turning back. "Enough, George. I want to see her fall." George rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate. He approached Julian, leaning down until they were at eye level. "If you're lying to me, Julian, there won't be a place on this earth where you can hide from me." Julian's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear breaking through his composed demeanor. He nodded slowly, his voice steady but low. "I'm not lying, old man. You and I, we want the same thing." George studied him for another second, the intensity in his gaze unyielding, before stepping back. "Stay here and watch over the girls. If anything happens to them..." He left the threat hanging, sharp and clear. "I know," Julian replied, raising his hands in surrender. George turned toward Daniela and Mariana, his gaze softening. He knelt beside them, brushing a strand of hair from Daniela's face before pressing a kiss to each of their foreheads. "I'll come back for you. I promise." Mariana stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open just enough to whisper, "Be careful, Grandpa." George nodded, holding her words close like a shield. He stepped outside, the cold rain hitting his face like a baptism. The world beyond the cabin felt vast, unwelcoming, but his resolve was ironclad. Each step he took was driven by one thought: Lucia must pay. The path to the hills stretched endlessly, but George's fury kept him moving. Every painful step reminded him of all he had lost: his son's kind smile, the laughter of his granddaughters echoing in the garden, memories now tainted by Lucia's cruelty. When he reached the estate, he crouched low in the brush, his sharp eyes scanning the property. The house was larger than he remembered, but its grandeur had faded. The paint peeled in strips, and several windows were broken. 2 men with rifles stood at the entrance, laughing and smoking, their casual demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing within George. "She's inside," he was certain. Though his body no longer carried the strength it once did, the fire burning in his chest gave him focus. Quietly, he moved through the shadows, his every step calculated. The guards never saw him coming. George gripped a large stone from the ground and, with a single swift motion, brought it down on the head of the first man. The guard crumpled, unconscious, without a sound. The second guard spun around, his eyes wide with shock, but George was already on him, slamming him against the wall. His hands locked around the man's throat, tightening just enough to drain the fight from him. "Don't scream," George said, his voice low and menacing. "I don't want to kill you, but I will if you make me." The man's face paled as he nodded furiously. George released his grip, but kept his piercing gaze locked on him. "How many are inside?" George demanded. "Just her. Just Lucia," the man stammered, his hands trembling. "I swear, it's only her." George pointed toward the road. "Run, don't stop, and don't come back." The man didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, his footsteps fading into the night. George pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The stale scent of tobacco and overpowering perfume hit him instantly. The dimly lit room was heavy with silence, the curtains drawn tight. On the coffee table, a half-full glass of wine rested next to a lit cigarette. "You came faster than I expected." Lucia's voice floated from the shadows, smooth and mocking. George turned towards the sound. She stood at the base of the staircase, a glass of wine in one hand, her signature smirk curling her lips. "You always underestimate people," George replied, his voice calm, measured, as he stepped forward. "That was your mistake." "Mistake?" Lucia laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. She took a step closer, her eyes glittering with disdain. "I don't make mistakes, George. I plan. I execute. Are you here to kill me, old man? In front of your granddaughters? In front of the world?" She tilted her head, her expression daring. That would be a sight worth watching. George stopped, his piercing gaze locked on hers. His expression betrayed no anger, no hatred, only a dangerous, unshakable calm. "I don't need to kill you," he said, his voice steady as stone. "You're finished, Lucia. The police are on their way. The hospital's security cameras caught you walking into my granddaughter's room. Everyone knows it was you. There's no escaping this." Lucia's face froze, her once confident demeanor cracking like fragile glass. She took an unsteady step back, the wine glass slipping from her grasp and shattering on the floor. Her breathing quickened, each gasp more frantic than the last. "No, this can't be happening." "Oh, it's happening," George replied, his voice steady, his eyes locked on hers. "You thought you could manipulate everyone, that you were untouchable. But the truth, Lucia, the truth can't be controlled." Lucia's fury ignited, transforming her features into a mask of raw hatred. Her voice, sharp and venomous, cut through the tension. "This isn't over, George. Do you hear me? I'll be back for you, and for those girls." "You won't be back," George said with quiet resolve. He turned his back on her, walking calmly out the front door. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night as police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of the house. Officers stormed in, their weapons drawn, shouting orders. Lucia screamed and fought, but her defiance was useless. This time, she had no control. There was no escape. Outside, George tilted his head upward as the first drops of rain began to fall. He stood motionless, letting the rain soak through his clothes, eyes closed, arms slack at his sides. It was over. When George returned to the cabin, the warm light from the windows greeted him. His granddaughters, Daniela and Mariana, rushed toward him, wrapping their small arms tightly around his waist. "I told you, my girls," George whispered, his voice soft with relief. "I promised I'd come back." "Is it over now, Grandpa?" Mariana asked, her wide eyes filled with hope. "Yes," George replied, a faint smile breaking through his tired expression. It's over. The crackling fire in the hearth cast a comforting glow across the room as George sat with his granddaughters nestled close. The warmth of the flames embraced them, but it was the bond between them that truly ignited the space. George knew in his heart that his real legacy wasn't the house or the money that had caused so much turmoil. It was his family, the love, resilience, and unbreakable connection they shared. That was something no one could ever take away. Thank you for joining us for this emotional story. What would you have done in George's situation? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends and family. It truly helps us keep bringing you these heartfelt stories every day. Stay tuned for more captivating tales just around the corner. Click the links on your screen now for more unforgettable narratives. See you in the next video.